All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our early bird special on game camera surveys setting up for best success. This will be presented by Plateau wildlife biologist David Riley. So this is just a brief presentation before we kick off our Converting to Wildlife Management presentation at 6 p.m. Because we're so limited on time, we will not be taking questions for this portion of the presentation, but we will provide David's contact information at the end in case you'd like to submit a follow-up question that way. So without further ado, I'll let David go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Avalon. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about game cameras and game camera surveys. I've been known to be long-winded, so I'm going to shorten this as much as I possibly can. So Clay, if you can go to that next slide for me. So talking about game camera surveys and the different types of surveys that are out there, really the first thing that comes to most people's minds when you think about a game camera survey is monitoring white-tailed deer populations and recording those via a game camera. So that's one type of survey. Another type of survey that we generally recommend for landowners are just a general wildlife survey. Those can be done with game cameras as well. And really the type of survey kind of depends upon your goals, your vision for your property. If you're planning on doing a high level of white-tailed deer management, some type of survey is definitely needed. It may be a game camera survey, it could be a spotlight survey. It could be a conjunction of the two. But if you're planning on maybe just managing for songbirds or small mammals on your property, general wildlife survey may kind of fit the bill for you there. So it just kind of depends upon what your goals are. So deciding on that is definitely kind of the first step in setting up a survey and deciding what way you want to go with it, because both of them have a little bit of different aspects of them that will apply. So when you decide to go ahead and set up that survey, the first thing that you really want to think about is site selection. And that kind of also talks about the property as a whole. So we generally recommend about one game camera per 100 acres. So for smaller properties, that may only be one game camera. Anything below 100, feel free, you can put an extra game camera in there. It doesn't hurt anything. And the biggest portion of that as well is to be sure that that whenever you put those game cameras out, that you're kind of distributing them throughout the property evenly. You don't want all of your game cameras on the north side of the property and nothing on the south side. So you want to kind of distribute them as much as possible on the property. And then when you're choosing your site selection, you can choose areas where you may see some activity of white-tailed deer, may see activity of general wildlife on the property, and set your game cameras up there. For white-tailed deer selection or white-tailed deer game camera survey, as you'll hear me talk about in this next bullet point, would be baiting. You can do the same thing as well for general wildlife surveys. So you can put game cameras near feeders. You can put game cameras near water sources, near trails, even natural water sources. Ponds are great, or even if you have a supplemental water source, you can put them there as well. Those are always areas where wildlife's going to congregate. Those are always areas where white-tailed deer will be, so you can get some good photos of them in those areas. Other things to keep in mind whenever you're looking at site selection, and probably the one that'll cause the most frustration, is make sure you find an area where you can kind of clear at ground level. You can clear out any brush, clear out any tall grasses. Always keep an eye out too. You may have some low-hanging limbs. Go ahead and clear those all out. It's really frustrating down the road after you've done 2 weeks of surveys and you find out you've got 10,000 photos and 95% of them are a tree or a leaf blowing in the wind. So it's always important to do those. You can locate your cameras about 12 to 20 feet or so from your bait site or from the site where you're expecting the wildlife to utilize. That'll give you some good clear photos, but not too far away that it makes hard for identification. You can also put these game cameras, they're so small now, you could even set them up if you're doing a general wildlife survey and wanting to look at songbirds. You could set those up really close to maybe a platform feeder in a tree or something there, so you can get really good photos, close photos of songbirds for a general wildlife survey. Digital cameras, if you're utilizing those, there's a lot of technology and a lot of settings on game cameras now. But one of the settings that we always like to recommend is make sure that you set the delay on the camera to 5 minutes, no less than 5 minutes for sure. If you set it anything lower than that, you might get the same photo of the same animal for the next hour that they're hanging out there, and just kind of reduces and makes photos a little bit more manageable, a little bit easier for you. On that same site selection, like I said, baiting and scent lures are definitely something that you can use when you're doing a whitetail deer survey. Baiting is for sure something that you're going to want to do, and then pre-baiting as well is something that I would recommend. Pre-bait an area for a whitetail deer survey for 7 to 10 days or so, just to get the wildlife utilizing it, making sure that you're getting them coming to that area, and try to reduce as much time that you're spending in that area. Don't hang out there. Try to keep the scent of yourself just away from it as much as possible. And then for a general wildlife survey, you can, like I said, you can put those near feeders. You can bait those areas. You can utilize scent lures. So if you're maybe wanting to get a little bit of an idea of some of the predators you may have, you can use scent lures in those areas to get a little bit of an idea. And then time of survey and length of survey. Those are kind of the two biggest questions that I get whenever I talk about game camera surveys. And the time of survey. So what time of year should we be doing those? Well, for a whitetail deer survey, generally those are done pre-season. So sometime right about now into this early part of October, we're seeing a lot of these game camera surveys happen for whitetail deer. This is a good time. All of the bucks have most of their antler growth there. You have fawns that are up and movable and moving around so that they'll be in the photographs as well. So right now is a really good time to do that. If you happen to come across, if you happen to be in an area where maybe a late rut season comes in, you could probably go a little bit further into October and still get some. Big thing is try to do these surveys when some of the natural food sources aren't as readily available. So when acorns aren't on the ground, reasoning for that is deer aren't going to come to your corn if there's enough food to eat out in the brush. So definitely keep that in mind when you're thinking about the time of your survey. For whitetail deer. For general wildlife, there's really not a specific time to do those. You can do those throughout the year. You can do those really at any time. The only thing I say to keep in mind is kind of the same thing with the whitetail deer surveys. Keep an eye out on just your natural food sources. You may not get as many wildlife. And depending upon what your goals are, if you're looking for songbirds, you may want to do that during migration season, just to see what birds are migrating through your property. But for small mammals and other things, just keeping an eye out as well as on the weather patterns. If we have another winter like what we did this winter in February, you're not going to see as much wildlife moving around at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So keep that in mind whenever you're setting up your survey. And you can definitely run those at any time and even throughout the year. Length of survey. Again, this differentiates a little bit between whitetail deer and general wildlife. For a whitetail deer survey, it's pretty important that you run these surveys for about 10 to 14 days at least. Anything more than that, you're going to have a lot of photos. It's going to become a little bit more harder to manage if you have more photos than that. You can utilize 14 days worth of data even if you had your camera out there for 2 or 3 months. Just find 14 days worth of data, and you can utilize that to kind of to create some recommendations for your harvest on that. From a general wildlife survey, I have landowners throughout the state that do surveys from January 1st to December 31st. They keep the game cameras out there all the time. They go change out the SD cards, check the batteries on them once a month, and then just save all their photos onto their computer and go through them throughout the month while it's still taking photos. But you can also do this as just maybe a 1 or 2 month thing during migratory bird season. Or you could do it maybe in the fall, maybe see a little bit more wildlife. So it's really a little bit more of an open book when you talk about general wildlife surveys. And then interpreting data. Interpreting data is probably the most important portion of doing game camera surveys, because you have all these photos. You've seen a lot of wildlife, you've seen a lot of white-tailed deer, but then you got to interpret that data. By no means today am I going to go through the mathematical portion of interpreting data. I'm not a math major by any means. I have a little Excel document where I can put in my numbers and get out some recommendations based on that So I don't know a lot of the math behind it, but I did provide a link here. This is the National Deer Association, and they've got a really good step by step, pretty much what I'm doing here today, a little bit of a step by step program for doing trail cameras, and they talk about interpreting that data, how to crunch some of those numbers on your property and what you see. The important thing is on interpreting that data is once you do get those numbers, such as buck to doe ratios or doe to fawn ratios, utilizing that data then to help make some recommendations for future wildlife management, for future deer harvest. And then same thing for general wildlife. You can utilize that data, and it won't be, you won't be really making population estimates. You can probably a little bit on some of the wildlife depending upon what you're looking at. But for a general wildlife survey, really some of the data that you want to keep and some of the things that you want to make note of is you want to make note of the different species that you're seeing. If you can't identify them, you can maybe at least identify that it's a different species you hadn't seen before. So just keep a running log and a running list of the different wildlife that you've seen. And then looking back at that data over a period of time can let you know how some of your wildlife management activities may be helping improve diversity on your property, and bring in some of that species and richness there. One thing to keep in mind too with that, whenever you do a general wildlife survey, is to make sure that you pay attention to. Trying to remember, I kind of lost my thought there for a second. But yeah, so whenever you do those general wildlife surveys, they're wonderful. You can see a lot of different species. And now I remember what my thought was. Whenever you're doing those, something that you can also gain from it is maybe some of the other activities that you may be wanting to conduct on your property. So with general wildlife surveys in most of the state, there's a very good chance that you're going to come across feral hogs on your game camera at some point. And same thing with white-tailed deer. You'll probably still come across them there. But that could be some useful tools, seeing what a feral hog population on your property might look like, knowing where they're going to, knowing when they're moving throughout your property, can be really useful for helping set up predator control activities. So having that data kind of in your playbook whenever you're looking at maybe predator control activities is important, as well as with your supplemental water or your supplemental feed. You can utilize when knowing when wildlife are utilizing it more. Songbird feeders is a good example. If you have a game camera on that, you can tell probably through March through July when they're utilizing it the most. Maybe you might need to fill that feeder a little bit more, but those game cameras can kind of provide that little bit of information that you need to do that. And then lastly, along with game camera surveys, and especially when we talk about white-tailed deer and white-tailed deer management, one thing to also include would be doing some harvest data collection. This is really good data that you can then utilize on the back end, along and supplement with some of your game camera data that you might have. So you have your game camera data and your recommendations that you've made off of that for what you're going to harvest this coming season. And then after you do harvest things in the coming season, keeping information like sex, weight, antler data, age, those kind of things are really important on that harvest data collection, because you can compare the two. You can bring them both together and looking at game cameras, looking at harvest data, and see what type of deer that you're harvesting, get a little bit more of an idea of the health of your white-tailed deer population. Can be really useful for that aspect of it. And as y'all will talk with Clay here shortly about converting into wildlife management, one activity category in there is going to be census, and game camera surveys and harvest data collection. Those are both two activities that fall underneath that category. So documentation wise, things to keep for these, about 15 to 30 game camera photos from throughout the year. Most central appraisal districts don't want to see more than that. But if you keep about 15 to 30 of them, you can keep those game camera photos along with some short log or even a short report that just kind of outlines what you learned from the game camera survey, and the species that you've seen throughout the year and how it may affect future management. Those are really good pieces of documentation that you can use, and is highly recommended whenever you're doing a wildlife camera survey. So I think Clay's going to jump to the next slide. That's going to be my contact info. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about game camera surveys or white-tailed deer management or anything like that. Feel free to reach out to me. There's also Tucker's going to be on here as well. So if there's anything that pops up that maybe y'all can get to those questions towards the end of it. Tucker may be able to answer those as well, but feel free to reach out to me. I think I'm out of time. I think I did it right on time.
You're right on time. Thank you so much for joining us, David. And I know we got to move into the converting to wildlife management section. I will take this contact information in case you have questions about the game camera survey portion, and I'll stick it in our chat section. So you can hop over there, copy and paste his email, write down his phone number, and you can always reach out that way. Thank you again, David.
Thank y'all.
Night.